Hello and welcome to Novara Live. I'm your host, Ash Sarkar, and joining me tonight is journalist and author, Micha Frazer-Carroll. Micha, how are you doing?
I'm good, thanks, Ash. I'm enjoying this sunny, fine day today. How are you?
Also, would have been enjoying a sunny, fine day, but I've got to be locked in the Novara office scripting this show. Fox says that I'm allowed to see daylight only when the work is done. Coming up tonight, Downing Street advisors are still fighting like rats in a sack over Sue Gray's salary. Keir Starmer has vowed he's still in control and will carry on taking numerous freebies. Stay tuned for all of that. But first, the situation in Lebanon. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah has addressed 2 days of Israeli attacks on Lebanon. In a wide-ranging speech, Nasrallah described Israel as having crossed every legal, ethical, and humanitarian red line. He also accused Israel of trying to kill thousands of people, and he called the attacks a terrorist act and a massacre, saying they amounted to a declaration of war against the people of Lebanon and the country's sovereignty. Now, even Hezbollah's staunchest opponents may actually find themselves agreeing with that assessment. Over 2 days, Israel conducted a series of attacks on Hezbollah through the synchronized explosions of booby-trapped devices across Lebanon. On Tuesday, those devices were pagers, thought to have been rigged with around 10 grams of military-grade explosives. Yesterday, the explosions involved a range of devices containing radio receivers, including walkie-talkies and radios. All in all, over 3,000 people have been injured and at least 37 people killed, including 2 children and a hospital doctor. The severity of the attack means the signs now point to an outright war between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Retired Israeli Brigadier General Amir Avivi made that case to the Associated Press, saying this: "You don't do something like that, hit thousands of people, and think war is not coming. Why didn't we do it for 11 months? Because we were not willing to go to war yet. What's happening now? Israel is ready for war." That conclusion appears to have been confirmed by Israel's defense minister. Speaking at an Israeli airbase last night, Yoav Gallant told military staff that Israel's war in the region was entering a new phase, and he announced that the country would be diverting forces, resources, and energy towards the north. "We will need consistency over time," he said, adding that, quote, "this war requires great courage, determination, and perseverance." That diversion of military power to the north has begun, with the deployment of the IDF's 98th Division to Israel's border with Lebanon. This is from AP. The 98th Division is believed to include thousands of troops, including paratrooper infantry units and artillery, and elite commando forces specially trained for operations behind enemy lines. The deployment was confirmed by an official with knowledge of the matter, who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss troop movements. Overnight, Israel also conducted air raids with warplanes and artillery fire, attacking 7 sites across southern Lebanon. After October 7th, Lebanon began cross-border strikes on Israel in solidarity with Gaza. Since then, Israeli strikes inside Lebanon have killed nearly 500 people. Hezbollah attacks on northern Israel have killed around 40, but the almost daily cross-border conflict has led to the evacuation of around 100,000 Lebanese from their homes, as well as 60,000 residents of northern Israel. And in an address to the nation last night, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pledged to return those Israeli residents to their homes in northern Israel. Israel's aim, then, appears to be, at a minimum, to challenge that status quo along its border with Lebanon. But it may also have the broader goal of a more permanent destabilization of forces it sees as Iran-backed proxies in the region, namely Hamas, other Palestinian groups, and Hezbollah. One question is whether Israel has the resources to maintain a war in Gaza, an occupation in the West Bank, and a drawn-out conflict with a large, well-armed, and highly disciplined military force like Hezbollah. Another is whether Netanyahu will have the support of the broader Israeli public. On Newsnight, former Israeli negotiator Daniel Levy was asked what reaction we should expect from the Israeli public to the operation.
What one would expect, and I think is going to be borne out, is there's a sugar high, right? This is great. But the extent of the internal polarization is not going to go away. And so what you are seeing and will see is the protest movement that's saying, okay, you pulled this off, but what's the next step? Is this going to allow the displaced residents from Israel's north who've been away from their homes? Are they going to be able to move back as a consequence of this? Will this bring back the Israelis being held in Gaza? This clearly isn't going to make a ceasefire or a deal any more likely. So that polarization inside Israel, which isn't about feeling sorry for Palestinians or Lebanese, but it is about which direction Israel is going in. And what you're seeing in Israel, and there were news reports coming out just in advance of this potential escalation in Lebanon, is there is a degree of exhaustion in the military. Elite units are saying we can't serve any more reserve duty. So that division, which weakens Israel, is still there.
Israel's military is overstretched and increasingly exhausted, and public support is divided. Yet the Netanyahu government seems determined to press ahead. That determination is evident from emerging details about Israel's operation behind the exploding devices in Lebanon. The New York Times reports that Israel's Trojan horse operation didn't involve tampering with devices intended for Hezbollah, rather it involved manufacturing them. The story begins with an instruction earlier this year from Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah to move Hezbollah members away from mobile phones and to communication devices that were less easily traceable by Israel. These included pagers, walkie-talkies, and other analog devices. That's when Israel's spy agency Mossad saw a gruesome opportunity. 12 intelligence officials described the operation to the New York Times under condition of anonymity. The Times reports this. By all appearances, BAC Consulting was a Hungary-based company that was under contract to produce the devices on behalf of a Taiwanese company, Gold Apollo. In fact, it was part of an Israeli front, according to 3 intelligence officers briefed on the operation. They said at least 2 other shell companies were created as well to mask the real identities of the people creating the pages, Israeli intelligence officers. BAC did take on ordinary clients for which it produced a range of ordinary pages, but the only client that really mattered was Hezbollah, and its pages were far from ordinary. Produced separately, they contained batteries laced with the explosive PETN, according to the 3 intelligence officers. The pages began shipping to Lebanon in the summer of 2022 in small numbers, but production was quickly ramped up after Mr. Nasrallah denounced cell phones. So Israel's escalatory attack on Lebanon wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, but the product of a plan spanning 9 months. Now, if Israel does go to war with Hezbollah, it'll only serve the country's security if it ultimately wins. But even if it doesn't win outright, someone still stands to gain: Benjamin Netanyahu. This was Lebanon's ambassador to the UK on Sky News.
If Benjamin Netanyahu was not in power, then you may be in a very different situation.
I cannot speculate, so I judge what I see. I see a dwindling ruling coalition in Gaza, in Israel. And I've always said it's Netanyahu is like riding a bicycle. The moment he stops, he would fall. So he needs to put his country continuously on a path of war and violence, because the moment he stops, he would face the consequences internally.
And what's your message to the Israeli people?
If you want peace, you have to work for peace. You have to elect officials who respond to peace initiatives. The Arab, since 2002, have chosen peace as a strategic objective. Unfortunately, no response from the other side.
It may be that Israel is heading to war to save the career of a rogue prime minister. And yet, so-called allies of Israel continue to refuse to face reality. This was White House National Security Advisor John Kirby.
These kinds of tactics, blowing up pagers and walkie-talkies, is this type of warfare acceptable to the United States?
Again, Mary, I appreciate the question. I'm simply not going to be able to address these incidents over the last couple of days in any level of detail one way or another.
Okay, let me try one other thing.
Please.
Everyone keeps urging, all parties involved not to escalate this. Isn't this an escalation already? I mean, isn't this Israel doing exactly what you've been warning them not to do?
Again, I'm not going to speak to the details of these incidents. I understand that's frustrating. I get it. And I understand where all your questions are coming from. They're all valid. They're all fair. I'm just not going to get into this. I will add, if I could, and restate a little bit to what I said to Gabe. We still don't want to see an escalation of any kind. We don't believe that the way to solve where we're at in this crisis is by additional military operations at all. We still believe that the best way to prevent escalation, to prevent another front from opening up in Lebanon, is through diplomacy, which is why Mr. Hochstein was over in the region this week. And we're still going to pursue those kinds of outcomes.
So, no specific comment from the US on Israel's almost certainly illegal, indiscriminate attack across Lebanon. And that commitment to diplomacy sounds good until you realise the Biden administration continues to talk out of both sides of its mouth. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has today said this. I spoke with Israeli Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant yesterday to review regional security developments and reiterate unwavering US support for Israel in the face of threats from Iran, Lebanese Hezbollah, and Iran's other regional partners. I emphasized the US commitment to deterring regional adversaries and efforts to de-escalate tensions across the region. I also reaffirmed the priority of achieving a Gaza ceasefire deal that will bring home hostages held by Hamas and an enduring diplomatic resolution to the conflict on the Israel-Lebanon border that will allow civilians on both sides to return to their homes. We're pursuing intense diplomacy, but our commitment to Israel is unwavering, even in the wake of what many would describe as a large-scale terrorist attack on Lebanon. This, obviously, will be a story that we'll continue to cover closely in the coming weeks and months. But my sense is that a wider regional conflict is something that Israel considers to be in its interests. Anything that pulls America more deeply into Middle Eastern conflict is good for Israel. Well, why? We all know that Israel couldn't wage a genocidal war on Gaza without US-supplied military aid and weapons. Quite simply, Israel doesn't have an industrial base big enough to wage permanent war. And despite Israel's reckless escalation of regional conflict and Washington's disapproval of such, the weapons keep flowing to Tel Aviv because ultimately, for all the finger-wagging about humanitarian aid and ceasefire deals, the US will back Israel over Lebanon, or Israel over Iran for that matter. For all intents and purposes, Israel is basically an American outpost in the region. The US stockpiles billions of dollars worth of American weaponry in Israel for rapid deployment by US forces in the Middle East. It considers Israel a bulwark against any expansion of Iran's sphere of interest. The human cost of Israel's pager attack in Lebanon is nothing short of horrifying. At least 37 people have been killed and thousands more injured after 2 days of communication devices exploding as a result of alleged Israeli sabotage. The following images have been blurred but depict injuries. In an overcrowded Lebanese hospital, blast victims are seen with fingers blown off and severe injuries to the groin, abdomen, and face. 9-year-old Fatima Abdullah was killed on Tuesday afternoon during the first round of explosions. The NYT write this about her. Fatima was in the kitchen on Tuesday when a pager on the table began to beep, her aunt said. She picked up the device to bring it to her father and was holding it when it exploded, mangling her face and leaving the room covered in blood, she said. Beirut-based ophthalmologist Professor Elias Warwick told the BBC this about the injuries he witnessed. I wanted to save at least one of the eyes of the victims to save their sight, and in some cases I couldn't. I had to remove both eyes because the ammunition had gone straight deep into the eyes. He continued, It was very hard. Most of the patients were young men in their 20s, and in some cases I had to remove both eyes. In my whole life, I had not seen scenes similar to what I saw yesterday. It should be said that implanting explosives in communications devices or modifying them to explode could plausibly constitute a war crime under international law. This is from the UN Protocol on Prohibitions or Restrictions on the Use of Mines, Booby Traps, and Other Devices. It is prohibited to use booby traps or other devices in the form of apparently harmless portable objects which are specifically designed and constructed to contain explosive material. But, funnily enough, there aren't many people in the Western media who seem all that concerned with the idea that Israel may have committed a serious war crime. In fact, there are more than a few who seem unable to contain their excitement. Here's Jeremy Bowen, international editor for BBC News, in his write-up. Attacking Hezbollah's communications network has delivered a tactical victory to Israel, the sort of spectacular coup you would read about in a thriller. However, there is a potentially serious strategic downside for Israel, because while this humiliates the powerful Lebanese militia and political movement, it doesn't deter them. Just for context, that's the second and third paragraph of his article. Civilian casualties aren't mentioned until the 18th and 19th paragraphs. And let's put it this way. If Hezbollah managed to launch a surprise attack on IDF combatants and Likud party members in the heart of Tel Aviv, do you think it would only be mentioned right at the end of an article that a child had been killed too? Not to be outdone, this was how Professor Anthony Glees wrote about the Lebanon attacks in The Sun newspaper. Israel's cunning attack on Hezbollah using the group's message pages is going to be the stuff of thrillers in years to come. Not even James Bond's Q came up with an idea like this, but the best and the brightest of Israel's conscripted army are all moved into IT cyber warfare. The way he writes about it, like it's swashbuckling and romantic, really turns my stomach. Again, what Israel did could very well be a war crime. And yet we're constantly being told how clever, ingenious, and exciting it all is. Striking a more somber tone at least was Dan Hodges of The Mail on Sunday. This is what he wrote on Twitter. It's hard to think of a more sophisticated and targeted attack on a terror group than the Pages, but Israel will still be condemned. So why can't the critics just be honest? They don't believe in her right to self-defense and never will. Here's an exchange between Dan Hodges and another Twitter user. This is Carpe Venom saying, "Was the 8-year-old girl killed targeted then?" Dan Hodges says no. Carpe Venom says, "Not as targeted as the method you're suggesting then. Not sure using terrorist tactics against terrorists is a great idea by Israel, and the UN seems to agree." Hodges then continued and said, well, no method is infallible. So look, here's where me and Dan Hodges differ. I don't think that sabotaging devices so that they explode, regardless of who's holding them or where they are, is targeted. So let's say that someone really wanted to kill me and they sabotaged my laptop to do it. Well, I could be on a plane, I could be on a train, I could be in a crowded cafe, or it could be my husband using my laptop, using it to watch Tottenham highlights. Or why don't we compare it to something like a car bomb? Like, sure, you can guarantee who owns that car officially, but you can't be sure who's going to be in it at the time of detonation. When it comes to mainstream media coverage, though, I don't think it gets more ghoulish than the front page of yesterday's New York Post. So what you can see from the headline is beep, beep, boom. 2,800 Hezbollah terrorists hit by exploding pager plot, and we've blurred out the image, but the front page image is a very gory picture of a man on a moped with a bloody injury by his groin. He's possibly dead, I'm not sure, and he has been one of the victims of this pager attack. It's difficult to imagine that had it been a Westerner killed in that kind of way, that any newspaper would think of displaying their gruesome injuries in that kind of way. It would never happen. But there's something else I'd like to draw your attention to, which is how tautologous the logic is. Everyone hit by an exploding pager was a Hezbollah terrorist. How do we know? Because they were hit by an exploding pager. And this is exactly what you see play out in the following exchange, which began with a tweet from Seamus Malakafzali. He posted this. Al Rasul Al Azam Hospital in South Beirut has announced that one of its employees, pictured below, has died from his wounds after his pager exploded in yesterday's attack. Pagers are in widespread use by healthcare workers in many countries, including Lebanon. And it generated this quote response from freelance journalist Oz Katerji. Oz says, the context not included here by the Hezbollah apologist Seamus Melekafzali is that this is a Hezbollah-affiliated hospital in an area controlled entirely by Hezbollah, and this medical professional was in possession of a Hezbollah pager because he was a member of Hezbollah. Now, there's a few things to say about this. So the first is that Hezbollah, as well as being a militant group who are a prescribed terrorist organisation in the UK, they have the responsibilities of a government in parts of Lebanon. So Hezbollah has a political wing and it has a massive civilian staff, and this is from the Council on Foreign Relations. Hezbollah essentially operates as a government in the areas under its control, and neither the military nor federal authorities can counter this, Arab Barometer analysts Mary Claire Roche and Michael Robbins write for Foreign Affairs. It manages a vast network of social services that include infrastructure, healthcare facilities, schools, and youth programs, all of which have been instrumental in garnering support for Hezbollah from Shiite and non-Shiite Lebanese alike. The UK government used to distinguish between prescribing Hezbollah's armed wing as a terrorist organisation, but not its political wing. That changed a few years ago. But still, it doesn't seem morally right to treat a doctor working in a hospital, which may be run by Hezbollah, as a combatant the same way that you would a soldier. Oz, however, seems to have his own idiosyncratic ideas about guilt by association. Here's another interaction from Twitter. One user, called Trevor Corey, says, was the 10-year-old girl Hezbollah? Oz Katerji replies, her dad was. Trevor Corey says, then why didn't hurt her dad? I thought it was discriminate. Oz Katerji replies, guess she shouldn't have been playing with the pager her dad uses to murder civilians with. That, to me, is just so incredibly callous and dehumanizing. It's basically blaming a child for being killed because she picked up a pager. It's blaming a child for being killed because of who her dad was. Micha, can you imagine a British, American, or an Israeli child being talked about in that way by Western journalists?
Absolutely not, Ash. I think, firstly, we really have to question, as you say, that insidious idea that you could blame a 10-year-old child for their proximity to a device that exploded. I feel like this really reminds me of what Black feminists talk about in the UK, this idea of adultification, the idea that young Black and brown children can be blamed, essentially victim blamed, for violence that is perpetrated against them. This idea that, they should have known better. We're talking about a 10-year-old child. And I think children of color are constantly, denied access to these ideas of innocence. The idea instead is that their deaths are justifiable. I also think that idea that you were pointing towards about journalists kind of gleefully celebrating and kind of, comparing these deaths to a thriller, it kind of raises this question, when people die as a result of attacks in the West or in majority white countries, we frequently hear these deaths quite rightly described or compared to horrors. And so it kind of raises this question, this patent double standard that you point towards, about actually whose deaths get compared to thrillers and whose get compared to horrors. And I think what we've been seeing from some journalists and commentators has been really abhorrent, and I think we're very right to kind of call them out.
One of the things that I find really striking is the language of, oh, it's like something out of a thriller, it's like something out of James Bond. I mean, it's been a while since I've watched a James Bond film, but I don't remember any films where he kills a 9-year-old child. Like, it seems to me that there's a real erasure of the loss of life here. So obviously you've got some people who, online will say, yeah, it was worth killing a child for. All right, that child was collateral damage. You've got some people saying that. But then you've got all these other very mainstream journalists talking about it with these like excited, almost like panting terms. And you just think, it's your job to cover the news. And you haven't covered a really essential part of that news story. The ruckus over Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff Sue Gray's £170,000 salary is rumbling on. Here's the BBC's political editor, Nicholas Watt, on Newsnight explaining where things stood last night.
That story went off like a stink bomb in Number 10 and across the wider Whitehall, because it was seen this is clearly some hostile briefing against Sue Gray. As I understand it, in the last few hours, this has now gone all the way to the top. The Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, has been called in to sort of look at this, but the view is there's only one person who can sort that out, and that one person is Keir Starmer. Now, how did we get here? There was a recent review, as I understand it, of the top 2 bands of special advisors' pay. That includes Sue Gray right up there at the top. And that's how she ends up earning £170,000, which is £3,000 more than the Prime Minister. I understand that there will now be a review of all the other bands, the more junior people, and there has been big resentment from those further down the bands, because they're saying, we've had a pay cut from what we earned when we were in opposition. And when they raised these concerns with Sue Gray in the last few months, she wasn't helpful. All they heard was, this is the system, this is the system.
So the special advisors, rumoured to be led by Starmer's head of political strategy, Morgan McSweeney, are at war with Sue Gray, and they're really angry. They were earning more in opposition than they are in government, and now Sue Gray's salary being higher than Keir Starmer's is being used as a lever to embarrass Number 10. What happened to the grown-ups being in charge, eh? Here's some more from Nicholas Watt.
It does sound very dysfunctional, and it looks like we've got 2 camps in Downing Street. On the one hand, we've got those who are on the long march through opposition into government, and that's led by Morgan McSweeney, who sort of masterminded the election campaign. Then there's the professional blow-in who came in the last year. That is Sue Gray. Now, these are the views from these 2 camps. I'm not necessarily saying these are the exact views of Morgan McSweeney and Sue Gray, but this is what I'm hearing. So the anti-Sue Gray camp, they're saying she's maladroit. She held down salaries. There were a lot of people who didn't get jobs when they came into government. She didn't have the decency to phone them up and say, terribly sorry, we're not taking you on board. And I'm told Sue Gray, control freakery over access to Keir Starmer. The pro-Sue Gray camp, the view there is they regard the briefings today against her as vitriolic. She, as I understand it, is upset and she's not taking it well. Her view with the special advisors is she had to professionalise them for government. There were some people, you're fine in opposition, you're not so good in government, so terribly sorry, you can't have a job going into government. Some of her supporters say, bit of a problem, maybe she doesn't really suffer fools gladly. And the view I'm hearing is that she can sometimes be a little holier than thou on pay.
I mean, I think the really interesting bit about Sue Gray is that her son got parachuted into a safe seat, but I'm sure that's got absolutely nothing to do with who his parents are. Anyway, it's just so good to have the adults back in the room. Despite Starmer's promise of change after 14 years of Tory rule, similarities between Number 10 under Starmer's Labour and Conservative chaos are being remarked upon just a few months into his premiership. It took 21 months and a global pandemic for Boris Johnson to become embroiled in the Wallpapergate scandal, thanks to leaks from former aide Dominic Cummings. And it took just 10 weeks for Number 10 insiders in Keir Starmer's government to be fighting like rats in a sack. That was last night, and the fury continued this morning. Here's Henry Zethman on Radio 4.
What has sparked such fury, and I use that word advisedly, among her very colleagues in government is that many of them, her fellow special advisors, for months had been angry that they believed they were being made to take pay cuts compared to their Conservative predecessors and to their own salaries working for the Labour Party in opposition. And now, courtesy of our story, they've discovered that there's at least one advisor for whom that's not the case, who's getting a pay rise, and that is the advisor at the top of the tree. I mean, remember, this is the Labour Party. People on the left don't like that sort of thing. And in terms of reaction, my phone is still lighting up this morning at this very early hour from people at the top of government who are outraged about this. I'm sure not many people's hearts bleed for a sort of pay dispute at the top of government. I mean, in terms of what her colleagues are outraged by, for example, this message I received this morning from a senior Labour figure saying people are flabbergasted by the feeling of hypocrisy. I think the read across there in terms of government is, and I'm sorry if this sounds a bit meta, but it's about, hang on, the fact that this story exists, the fact that someone took a considerable risk to tip Chris Mason off, and then the pair of us were able to find others to corroborate this story, is a sign of pretty corrosive tensions at the top of government, at the heart of government, in a government which is barely 2.5 months into its life.
I mean, that's the key point here. The Labour government right now should be riding high. They have just sailed into government on the back of a massive majority. But when it comes to public opinion, it does seem to be dwindling. Between stripping pensioners of their winter fuel allowance and the increasingly messy Sue Gray versus Spad's pay dispute, there's also the freebie scandal engulfing Keir Starmer. It's safe to say that Labour's post-election honeymoon period is dead and buried. It's all led to Starmer himself having to comment today, insisting that he's completely in control. He said this: "I'm focused, and every day the message from me to the team is exactly the same, which is we have to deliver. We were elected on a big mandate to deliver change. I am determined that we are going to do that." I've got to say, I was so tempted to try and attempt my Keir Starmer impression. Like, "I'm focused, and every day the message from me to the team is exactly the same." The key is to be a little bit adenoidal.
Yeah, firstly, just want to say love the Keir Starmer impression. I'm still working on mine. But yeah, I think on this story, like what is interesting about it is the different framings that have started to spring up around it. So as you kind of covered, there's this framing from lobby journalists and kind of the commentariat class, which is that this is not really a story about freebies. Like, what is interesting about this story is the fact that it reveals some infighting happening at the heart of government. What's interesting about this story is it's actually already been reported on. It's been reported on by Open Democracy last year. It was also reported on again by Double Down News. This was also never information that was private. It was always going to come out eventually. But what journalists like about this story is that someone has leaked it. There is the question of how much should kind of working people care about that? How much do we really get drawn into these kind of stories of Labour infighting? And then I think there's another framing that comes up, which is about, Keir Starmer's personality, this personal angle, this idea that it's a bit kind of overindulgent, a bit luxurious for him to be, going to see the horse racing, going to the football, going to Taylor Swift concerts for free. But I do think what we should really be focusing on is actually what it says about his politics and about the impact on policy. The journalist Paul Holden, who did an investigative piece for Double Down on this back in July, looked at what this kind of says about policy. He specializes in corruption, and he was interested in looking at each of these kind of donations or freebies that Starmer got and how it might potentially impact policy. And he pointed out that, he was given free tickets to the horse racing. These came from a gambling industry giant. That is really concerning when we think about the vested interest that they have around gambling regulations. Then there's also the luxury hotel stay that he was given. That was given to him by a billionaire who obviously is going to be invested in things like resisting the extreme wealth tax. And then also the tickets that he was given to the football. Some of these were given by a construction company that was recently accused of equipping buildings with dangerous cladding, which, as we know from the outcomes of the Grenfell Tower fire, that is a really concerning thing to be coming into kind of policy and, being influenced by donors. And so I think this is the thing that we should be focusing on, the potential really dangerous impact of all of these big, powerful giants having Keir Starmer in their pocket. And I think that's kind of what working people should be concerned about rather than this kind of infighting angle.
Those freebies that Micha mentioned are the reason why the pain for number 10 is showing no sign of letting up. Sky News have revealed that Keir Starmer has received gifts and freebies worth more than £100,000 since December 2019. He's received more expensive gifts than any other MP, and freebies worth 2.5 times more than those bagged by the next most gifted MP. And over 20 grand of those gifts and freebies have come flooding in since he became Prime Minister. Leader Lucy Powell is next on the list. Sorry, that should say Commons leader Lucy Powell is next on the list. A long way behind Starmer, but still with an impressive £40,000 worth of gifts and freebies. Keir Starmer's gifts include nearly £40,000 worth of clothes, accommodation, and glasses from Labour donor and peer Wahid Ali, who was then himself gifted a temporary pass to number 10. Starmer received £12,000 worth of tickets from the Premier League and £4,000 in tickets to see Taylor Swift during the election campaign. He has also been gifted the use of a corporate box by Arsenal, which is worth over £8,000 per game. It's worth noting that the Premier League is currently lobbying against a football regulator, and ministers are usually advised against accepting hospitality from an organisation involved in an ongoing regulatory decision. What seems more likely? That Premier League teams are gifting Starmer football tickets, gig tickets, and a private box at games out of the goodness of their hearts, or that they'll expect something in return? What wouldn't an organisation pay to get some quality time with the Prime Minister? To stem the flow of negative news coverage on Starmer's penchant for freebies, the government this morning sent out Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds.
£170,000 worth of freebies for the boss, £20,000 in the last 8 weeks alone. Interested to hear your defence.
Well, I would say there are a number of ways supporters support any political party, particularly an opposition political party, and sometimes that's support for campaign literature, sometimes it's support for staffing costs, sometimes it's more of a personal nature, but I have no objection to that, and we have very clear rules and transparency in place in this area, so I have no objection to how the system works.
All right. I'm going to fill you in on something, because on Monday I did Politics Live and there was a newly elected Labour MP. The way in which this newly elected Labour MP was talking about the freebie stuff when the cameras weren't rolling was rolling the eyes, not saying anything with their words, but saying enough with their face and their gestures to be like, oh, what a stupid thing. I'm like up here to defend. And then cameras roll and he's just like, I see nothing wrong with this. And I always think about that difference between what people really believe and what they're saying when it comes to defending the indefensible. I always have that in my mind. Sky News' Kay Burley didn't appear satisfied with Reynolds' assertion that he's fine with it.
You're very content that you're taking £300 off pensioners while he's freeloading with £170,000 worth of freebies, 2.5 times more than the nearest person to him on the list, and significantly more than even people like Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak.
Well, first of all, I think you're conflating two issues there. The reason we've had to make some tough decisions already in the first 2 months is because there's a big black hole in the public finances. And the only way we have the opportunity to tackle that, to give this country the stability it needs, is because of what Keir Starmer did in changing the Labour Party, winning that election, and giving us a chance to move on from that Tory division and chaos. I don't think that is the same thing. And I know Keir Starmer personally. I know how hard he works. If he's going to a football match or anything to give himself a little bit of a wider life experience than just working every second. Again, I don't have any objections to that as long as it's transparent.
As long as Keir Starmer's getting the significant and lovely experience of seeing Taylor Swift and the wider life experience of going to see Arsenal, though, eh? Fox, I told you to get rid of that team from the auto cue. Reynolds seems to think it's all okay, as long as these donations are reported. But it's not just about transparency. The majority of voters don't think these kinds of donations are acceptable. And Reynolds is sorely out of step with public opinion on the specific issue of gifted clothing and tickets. As a survey from More in Common shows that just 7% of the public thinks that MPs accepting donations for clothing is okay, and 8% think that MPs getting free tickets to gigs and sporting events is acceptable. But Starmer reckons taking football freebies is doing all of us a favour.
Now I'm Prime Minister, the security advice is that I can't go into the stands. Or if I did, you'd have to put so much sort of security in that it would cost the taxpayer a fortune. As a result, I've been offered tickets elsewhere in the ground where it's more secure. We don't have to use taxpayer money on additional security, and that's why I've taken the decision that I have. I think most people watching this would say, well, fair dues. I think they'd think I was pretty self-centred if I said, I'd much prefer to be in the stands, by the way. If I said, I'm going in the stands and you, the taxpayer, are going to have to pick up the tab for the security. I'm not really going to do that. If the security advice is, don't go in the stands, go elsewhere that's more secure in the stadium, I'm going to follow that advice.
See, Jeremy Corbyn, when he was Labour leader, was often pictured in the stands watching Arsenal with his sons. Again, that was one of the worst things about him. So I understand why it might be different for a prime minister. And I think it's fine for a prime minister to get free tickets to a major sporting event that you'd expect to see a prime minister at, like a World Cup final or a Euros final or something of that nature. Where England are playing, obviously. I'm not just saying like he can go see like Germany versus Spain or whatever. That would be fine. But you don't have a God-given right to see your favourite football team. Like, you just don't. Drives me crazy. Micha, for me, I've got a question here about Keir Starmer's political judgment, because it seems to me that it would be quite straightforward to just end this now, to say, you know what, I'm going to return the clothes. I'm going to institute a rule, which means that I'm not going to accept freebies unless it meets that threshold of a major national event where you'd expect to see a prime minister, and the rest I'm going to pay for myself, right? He could do that. It would end this round now. Why doesn't he?
So I think there's something here about Starmer being, Mr. Rules, him having this kind of image which is all about following the rules, about being this prolific human rights lawyer. We saw that come up around Partygate and various other Tory scandals when Labour was in opposition. And I think what we're going to see with this story is a real insistence that he didn't break the rules, that actually he's done everything above board, he's declared it all, and therefore it's okay. And I think that really reveals something about a lack of scruples. I think, you and I were both journalists, and I'm sure you also know how frequently journalists are offered free things. And often we kind of know intuitively that we shouldn't take them, because although it might not technically mean, okay, you're definitely going to write a favorable story about this organization, etc., you know that it brings them closer into your world. It brings you closer to their influence. It makes you feel more likely that you owe them something back. But I think Starmer has shown, repeatedly that he is not that different to the Tories. And I think this is just another area in which he's similar to them. I thought it was really interesting to discover, you were talking about Corbyn, that throughout his entire time as Labour leader, I think he accepted one corporate gratuity, which was a ticket to Glastonbury, where he was speaking on the pyramid stage. I think that shows like a real awareness of the fact that actually, being principled and having scruples around what you take from people ends up in better policy, stronger leadership, being able to stand by your decisions. And, Corbyn also a huge fan of Arsenal. And like you say, he knew that taking free tickets or, going in the box would have shown something about how he relates to big corporations versus, ordinary working people. So, yeah, I think it really comes down to having, a robust political compass. And that's something that time and time again, Starmer has shown that he lacks.
I think there's also something which I find really gross about someone who earns over £160,000 a year, basically saying, well, unless I accept these corporate freebies, I can't live the way that I want to. And, it's like, if you can't afford to do the things you want to do on £160,000 a year, how is anyone else supposed to be able to do the things that they want to do?
How are the rest of us living? And I think this is one thing that just seems like patently ridiculous about, we've seen various politicians, David Lammy, etc., coming out and defending Keir Starmer and saying, he needs to look the part, he needs to dress the part. The idea that Starmer can't afford to buy his own glasses, to buy his own suits, to, get a dress for his wife, to look kind of presentable or appropriate in the public eye, is a bit of a slap in the face to the rest of the general public, who obviously couldn't even dream of seeing salaries like that.
I just want people to know that I bought this jumpsuit with my own money. It was not a corporate freebie. I got it and I really like it, even though my partner thinks it makes me look boxy. Who let the dogs out? Or should I say, wolves? Now, before I go into the detail of this story, I just want you to be able to enjoy this Daily Mail headline without any context. Howling mad! Fury, as school allows people suffering from species dysphoria to identify as a wolf. Now, personally, howling mad isn't the one I would have gone for. I think I would have gone for something a bit more like, oh, the country's gone to the dogs, or canine, you believe it. Anyway, what the Mail claims is this. A British schoolchild has been officially allowed to identify as a wolf, the Mail can reveal. The secondary school pupil is said to suffer from species dysphoria, which is when someone claims their body belongs to a different species. The article continues. Confirmation of the first known case in Scotland in which a school has recognised that a pupil identifies as an animal was revealed in official documents. The Mail knows the name of the council involved but has decided not to disclose it to protect the identity of the child concerned. The local authority said the pupil belonged to a group who called themselves furries and identified with an animal persona. I think that's actually called a fursona. Anyway, the council said it offered personal support and more specific support from a well-being worker, including counselling and help with learning, adding, there is very little specific guidance on species dysphoria. So basically, what you can glean from that is apparently there's a kid in Scotland claiming that they're a furry, and the school and the council seem aware of it, and there's a well-being worker involved. Now, personally, I think there's a bit of a leap here from what the Mail claims they're able to prove and the claim of what is happening in a wider sense. So a school and a council saying, yeah, okay, this thing is happening with this one kid, and here's how we're dealing with it. That isn't the same as a school saying that species dysphoria is a real thing and that they're affirming the child's right to live as a wolf. Now, that hasn't stopped the Mail from drawing some pretty big conclusions. This is what Christopher McGovern wrote in the Scottish Daily Mail. Believe it or not, what amounts to protected status has now been awarded to a Scottish secondary school pupil who identifies as a wolf. The technical term for this latest example of educational lunacy is species dysphoria. Accommodating and excusing naughty behaviour by dressing it up in pseudo-medical terminology is all the rage amongst educators across the UK. It is part of the woke, politically correct victimhood industry that currently defines too much schooling. Believe it or not? Well, look, I'm going to go with not. And I've got a good reason for why this isn't passing my own personal smell test. There have been wild claims about child furries in the media, which have been subsequently debunked. And in fact, the Mail make reference to this in this very article. The news comes after a school in Aberdeenshire had to deny rumours last year that a pupil there was identifying as a cat and had been given a litter tray in the toilets. Forced to deny rumours. That's a pretty funny way of saying the media took a nonsense story and ran with it until it was debunked. So, Micha, why are the right so obsessed with the idea that furries have taken over the education system?
It's a difficult question to answer, Ash, because I'm sure, you feel similarly that it's hard to you almost don't want to dignify the story by giving it a rebuttal kind of within its own terms. I mean, it's clear that while trans people are actually not mentioned once throughout the copy of this entire article, this is clearly a kind of dog whistle that's talking implicitly about trans rights. All of these ideas about wokery, political correctness gone mad, etc., are kind of pointing to this idea that trans people should be their fundamental dignity and rights. And I think it essentially comes from a place that the reality that the right wing, as various other outlets, the centrist press, want to dehumanize trans people. I think this story is a really clear example of literal dehumanization by comparing them to animals. They're conflating the very widely documented experience of gender dysphoria with the idea of wanting to be an animal. I think, we've also throughout history seen this idea that giving civil rights to queer people or to trans people is going to somehow open the floodgates to loads of other things. Throughout history, we've seen the idea that, gay marriage is going to give rise to child grooming. The idea that, trans people being recognized is going to kind of give rise to people who believe that they're transracial or want to become animals, like this story. And the real world outcomes have never been as interesting as these kind of scaremongering stories. So I think what we really have to hold with stories like this is their ridiculousness and the fact that trans people are dying. They're disproportionately likely to be denied housing, healthcare, employment, disproportionately likely to be victims of violence. And so I think we have to really see this for what it is. It's a distraction. And like I said, I'm hesitant to kind of argue with them on their own terms because this is such a fringe case. And like you say, often these fringe cases, when you kind of dig a bit deeper, turn out to not really be what they're framed as by the media.
I think you made such an important point there, which is the same way people responded to same-sex marriage by being like, oh, what's next? Like, can a man marry his dog? It seems to me that the response to, I guess, a broadening societal awareness of the existence of trans people is that there's that riposte of like, oh, well, does that mean you can self-identify as anything? Like, can you self-identify as black when you're not? Or can you self-identify as a wolf? And I think it's like, it's one thing to say, well, you know, self ID, like maybe it means that you're drawing the boundaries of selfhood too widely, because I think that there's perfectly reasonable riposte to that where you say, well, actually it's not about letting people identify any old how, it's giving people the room to identify something that they've known to themselves for a really long time. Like, I think that you can say that without having to, indulge every furry on the block. And that's why they're so desperate for these stories. They're so desperate for these stories so that, as you said, it can discredit transgender people more broadly. Thanks, Micha, for joining me tonight.
Thank you so much, Ash. It's been great to talk.
My one quibble is that you said it was a transphobic dog whistle when you could have said it was a transphobic wolf whistle. And I hope that you would not miss such an opportunity to pun ever again. Thank you, everyone, for watching the show tonight. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.